Greetings, adventurer. Welcome back to the secret stacks. Back to the cool marble beneath your boots, the hush that lives between shelves, and the gentle, stubborn glow of candlelight that refuses to surrender to the under-mountain's breath. When last you sat across from me, you listened as I spoke of beginnings so old that even gods argue about their order. You heard the first lesson of the age of myth, the bright rivalry of Saloon and Shah, the first shaping of the heavens, the raw tumult of primordials and young gods, the first rules of magic, first Mistral's gift, then Mistra's care, and the strange truth that the realms were not born gentle, they were born contested. Tonight, we continue. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn, Laura Warden, and in the unkind parlance of frightened tavern-goers, Lich. If you are new to my lectures, let me offer the same reassurance I gave you in the first lesson. My hunger is for histories, not hearts. I chose this unending state so that time could not steal the past from Faerûn. I took on the chill of undeath willingly so that the living might keep warm beside the hearth of memory. And you, my returning apprentice, have done the most important thing a student can do. You came back. Before we unfurl the oldest maps, a brief word from today's generous sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, masters of crafting robust web applications and solving the thorny challenges of the modern internet. Whether you need an elegant front end, a scalable back end, or a seamless integration of the two, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They weave code with the same care that I weave stories. Now, settle in, adjust the velvet chair, let the world above Waterdeep, bright, loud, impatient, fall away for a while. Because tonight's lesson is not about kingdoms you can still visit by caravan road. It is not about ruins you can easily point to on a modern map. Tonight we speak of the days of thunder. Not thunder as you know it, the distant mutter above the Sword Coast when a summer storm rolls in. No. This thunder is the voice of a world still learning what it is. These are the years between roughly -35,000 and -30,000 by Dale reckoning, long before the year of sunrise, long before humans kept careful calendars, long before elves carved their first mythals, long before dwarves hammered their first clan runes into the bones of mountains. In these years, the world is young enough that continents still feel like wet clay beneath the hands of titans. The seas are not yet as they will be. The sky is not yet finished with its arguments. And life is experimental. You will sometimes hear sages call the peoples of this era creator races. That phrase is both useful and dangerously misleading. They did not create the world. They did not make the gods. They did not lay the weave like a net of silver across reality. Those are older tales, and we handled them in the previous lesson. But they did create, through craft, magic, and arrogance, many of the creatures you still meet today. They shaped life as a potter shapes clay. They were not merely rulers, they were designers. They were not merely conquerors, they were engineers of bloodlines. 3 names dominate the records of this age. The Saruk, scaled, ancient, serpent-minded. The Batrachi, amphibious, mutable, tidal-souled. And the Aeri, feathered, sky-bound, half myth and half fossil. I will speak of each, and of the war that never truly stopped between them. War for territory, yes, but also war for the right to define what life should become. I will also speak of a thing that matters more than any crown or city from this era, a tradition called the Waterdeep, and the artifact their work became, the Nether Scrolls. If you remember nothing else when you rise from your chair tonight, remember this. The Nether Scrolls are not just scrolls, and they are not netherese, not at first. They are a seed planted in the days of thunder that grows into forests of consequences. Netheril, the fall of empires, the birth of new magic, the return of ancient evils, and the endless temptation of mortals to grasp what was never meant for mortal hands. But I am getting ahead of myself. Close your eyes for a moment and let me set the stage. Imagine Faerûn not as a continent of familiar borders, but as part of a larger, older landmass that sages name Meruroboros. It is a supercontinent, a vast, knotted thing, pre-sundering and pre-familiar seas. Its coasts are ragged. Its interior is a patchwork of steaming jungles, great river deltas, shallow inland seas, salt flats that gleam like crushed glass, and mountain chains that have not yet learned their final shape. The air is heavy with life. Not always comfortable life, often life with too many teeth. In the swamps, great reptiles bask on mud banks beneath trees whose branches drip with vines. In the jungles, insects the size of shields wind like saw blades. In the shallows, coral forests rise like cities, and creatures you would call monsters are simply neighbors. And above it all, the sky is busy. Birds, yes, but also things older than birds, pterosaurs and scaled gliders, and shapes that do not fit your expectations. The boundary between natural and crafted is thin here. In the days of thunder, one must always ask, is this creature the child of the world, or the child of someone's spell? Now, one more important note before we descend. Sources for this era are uneven. We have fragments from Sarok ruins, translated by scholars who are often terrified of what they read. We have elven myths, told thousands of years after the fact, colored by tragedy and pride. We have dwarven songs that admit bluntly they did not yet exist upon the surface in these times. We have divine recollections, which are not always consistent, for gods are not immune to propaganda. And we have the whispering testimony of certain beings in the Underdark who remember the days of thunder because they were there, and because they have never left. So I will do what I always do. I will tell you what is widely attested. I will label what is debated. And when I offer interpretation, when I step beyond the ink and into the spaces between lines, I will tell you that as well. Now, let us begin with the first great architects of flesh, the Sarok. And as we do, keep your quill ready, my apprentice. Because the Sarok do not merely introduce the story of early Faerûn. They are the first proof that in this world, knowledge can be older than morality. And that the past, no matter how buried, never truly stays silent. The third lesson, the days of thunder and the scaled imperative. When you picture a serpent, you likely picture instinct. Hunger, strike, swallow, sleep. The Sarok are what happens when you take that image and add language, philosophy, and a ruthless confidence that the world was built to be redesigned. They were not merely lizard folk, and they were not merely Yuan Ti. Those peoples are their echoes, their experiments, their unintended grandchildren. The Saruk themselves were older, taller, stranger, often described in surviving carvings as having long, sinuous lower bodies like great constrictors, torsos that could pass for humanoid at a distance, and faces that held the unsettling calm of something that rarely feels surprise. Do not mistake their calm for peace. The Saruk were, by temperament, conquerors of the subtle kind. They did not always conquer with armies, though they had armies. They conquered by making themselves inevitable, by making the world around them depend upon systems only they understood, by creating servants, soldiers, and useful cousins, and then acting astonished when those cousins resented the Lich. They called their craft life-shaping. In later ages, you will hear of transmutation. You will hear of flesh to stone to flesh, polymorph, wild shape, and the great debates of wizardly colleges. Is the soul altered when the body is altered? The Saruk would laugh at such questions, not because they are foolish, but because they are late. To the Saruk, the body was always a manuscript, and magic was simply the ink. Life-shaping was not one spell. It was a discipline, a tradition, a way of thinking. Imagine a Saruk laboratory, not a room with beakers, but a temple hall carved in smooth green stone, cooled by subterranean water. In the center is a basin that looks like a baptismal font, but it is etched with spiraling glyphs that make your eyes ache when you try to follow them. The basin is filled with a viscous fluid that shimmers like oil on water. Around it stand Saruk mages, their tails coiled, their hands raised, not chanting nonsense syllables, but speaking in a language that treats biology the way a human treats mathematics. A bone becomes a variable, a muscle becomes an equation, a bloodline becomes a problem to be solved. And the solution is not always humane. Here is what the records agree upon. The Saruk created, directly or indirectly, many reptilian and serpentine peoples: Naga, Yuan Ti, troglodytes, terrafolk, and others so obscure that only specialist sages remember their names. Their earliest works were likely crude by their standards, but even crude Saruk work could produce a creature that could breed true, hold a culture, and survive long after its makers were gone. They did not always create from nothing. Often they took existing stock, beasts, proto-humanoids, perhaps even early humans, and altered them, improved them in their eyes, made them better suited to a purpose. And what purposes did they imagine? Servitude, war, information gathering, temple maintenance, environmental adaptation. In other words, the same reasons mortals later create golems, undead, and homunculi, except the Saruk preferred their tools to be alive. The most chilling part is this: they believed they were doing the world a favor. Many Saruk inscriptions speak of order, of stability, of proper design. Their philosophy, what we can reconstruct of it, treats the world as the untamed swamp in need of drainage. The Saruk considered themselves the engineers. Now, in the days of thunder, that philosophy gained a spine, and that spine was called Okoth. Okoth, the first great coil. Around -35,000 Dale Reckoning, the Saruk founded a realm that later scholars simply call Okoth. It rose in the southeast reaches of ancient Faerûn, near salt flats and inland waters that have since shifted, dried, or been renamed. What matters is not the precise modern coordinate, but the scale of the ambition. Okoth was not a city. Okoth was a claim. Within a handful of generations, an eye blink to elves, but a meaningful span to humans, the Saruk expanded their influence across huge swaths of the supercontinent. They built roads of fitted stone through jungles. They raised stepped pyramids above river deltas. They carved canal systems that turned marsh into farmland and farmland into a supply line. And wherever they went, life followed their rules. Here is the first lesson the Days of Thunder teaches any historian. Empire is easiest when you can rewrite the people you conquer. The Saruk did not merely defeat rivals. They absorbed them. They changed them. They made them into allies who could not easily rebel because the rebellion would require unmaking the body itself. Okoth's ruling caste treated life-shaping as both craft and sacrament. Their temples were laboratories. Their laboratories were courts, and their courts, in the Saruk mind, were not places where the ruled had rights, but places where the rulers proved their fitness by shaping the world correctly. Yet even a serpent can bite its own tail. Okoth fell, by most accounts, around -34,100 Dale Reckoning, not because a foreign army broke its walls, but because the Saruk turned their genius inward. Civil strife, rival philosophies of shaping, factions that believed the empire must expand, and factions that believed expansion diluted purity. Scholars argue about details, but the consequence is clear. Okoth fractured, and many Saruk withdrew from the world entirely. Some went deep into hidden enclaves, some went into the outer planes. Some sought immortality by means we will speak of later. Undeath, petrification, and other solutions that feel logical when one believes time is an enemy to be engineered. And in the midst of Okoth's death spiral stands one of the rare Saruk whose name survives intact. Pilitith, the Pale Emperor. Pilitith was an albino Saruk, unusual enough that even other Saruk apparently recorded it as notable. In surviving tales, he is described as pale as bone, a serpent of moonlight rather than jungle shadow. Whether this albinism was natural or the result of life-shaping, we cannot say. But symbolically, it matters, because Pilitith becomes a hinge between the old serpent empires and everything that comes after. He was the last emperor of Okoth, not last in the sense of a neat succession with a final coronation. Last in the sense that he held a dying thing together with will alone, and then watched it unravel anyway. When Okoth collapsed, Pilitith did not die with it. Instead, he did something that reveals the Saruk mind better than any sermon. He went looking for the source. Some accounts say that in their panic and pride, the Saruk of Okoth fled into the outer plains. They did not flee like refugees. They fled like engineers, escaping a collapsing tower, carrying blueprints under their arms, already imagining how they would rebuild somewhere safer. Pilitith led this wandering. And in the outer plains, among landscapes that do not obey Torril's physics, Pilitith found Mersholk, a serpent deity tied to Saruk and Yuan-Ti tradition. Pilitith asked to become the god's chosen. Pause there, my apprentice. Think about the audacity. A mortal emperor from a race already ancient walks into the heavens and petitions a god not for mercy, not for forgiveness, but for authorization. Not save us. Invest me. And for a time it worked. Pilitith led his people across planar reaches, searching for a place to settle, a place where they could rebuild without the embarrassment of defeat. But the plains are crowded with old grudges. In these wanderings, the Saruk earned the enmity of the Castas, another ancient reptilian people, themselves fierce, proud, and not inclined to kneel to serpent emperors. War followed, skirmishes, ambushes, the kind of bloodshed that leaves few survivors to write poetry about it. At last, Pilitith brought his dwindling people back to the ruins of Okoth. Not as triumphant reclaimers, but as remnants who had discovered a bitter truth. Even if you can cross plains, you cannot outrun consequences. Why does Pilitith matter to our era? Because his story tells you three things that echo forward into every later age. First, the Saruk were not trapped on Toril. They were planar. Their ambitions were cosmic. Second, the gods of Faerûn did not only shape mortals. Mortals shaped gods by seeking them, naming them, empowering them. Pilitith's petition is politics on a divine scale. Third, and most important, Okoth's fall did not end Saruk influence. It scattered it, like spores, like seeds. And scattered influence is often harder to eradicate than a centralized empire. The second coil, Mahershalk and the Southern Dream. Even as Okoth cracked, other Saruk realms rose. One of the most famous is Mahershalk, founded in the deep south around -34,800 Dale Reckoning. Mahershalk's ruins, later repurposed, reoccupied, and rewritten by other serpent folk, become a recurring shadow in realms' history. It is one of those names that adventurers whisper like a curse, because it sounds like a place where the walls themselves might have teeth. Mahershalk was a different kind of Saruk project. Okoth was breadth, conquest, system, administration. Mahershalk was depth, secrecy, priesthood, and the perfection of specific bloodlines. In the humid south, where jungle and ruin braid together, the Saruk built stone ziggurats whose interiors were cooler than the air outside, whose hallways were designed to amplify whispers and prayers. They crafted reliefs of coiled serpents swallowing suns. They bred servitor races not just to work, but to worship. And here, the Saruk's experiments take a turn that will poison Faerûn for millennia: the refinement of the Yuan-Ti. Yuan-Ti are not merely snake people, they are ideology made flesh. The Saruk conviction that the perfect servant is one who desires servitude because servitude is presented as ascension. In early forms, the Yuan-Ti may have been labor stock, guardians, temple attendants. But as Saruk power waned, Yuan-Ti power waxed. Around -33,500 Dale Reckoning, Mahershalk fell, and the lands were ceded, whether by conquest, bargain, or inheritance, to the Yuan-Ti who remained. Do not misunderstand. This is not a simple story of slaves overthrowing masters. It is a story of masters engineering successors without realizing those successors would someday be the ones holding the knives. If you have ever wondered why Yuan-Ti cults endure, why their rites feel older than most religions, why their ruins are built on ruins built on ruins, this is why. The Saruk did not merely leave behind people. They left behind programs, and programs keep running after the programmer is gone. Now, before we descend into the most infamous Saruk realm of all, Istosefifil, I want you to take a breath, because what we have spoken of so far is empire and philosophy. Istosefifil is where the Saruk show you their answer to fear. And their answer, as ever, is not humility. It is escalation. Istosefifil, the land of the lost sea. If Okoth is the Saruk at their most imperial, and Meher-Sholk is the Saruk at their most priestly, then Istosefifil is the Saruk at their most paranoid. And to be fair, paranoia is not always madness. Sometimes it is pattern recognition. Istosefifil rose around -34,500 Dale reckoning along the eastern shore of a great inland body of water called the Narrow Sea. Do not try to find the Narrow Sea on a modern map. Its ghost remains, but its shape is gone, its name buried beneath later catastrophes. In the days of thunder, the Narrow Sea was a ribbon of water cutting through the continent, connecting distant coasts, feeding wetlands, shaping climates. It was an artery. It was also a border. And borders breed war. Istosefifil's rulers knew something Okoth's rulers sometimes forgot. The world is not empty simply because you have not finished cataloguing it. Beneath the dunes and stone, beneath the layers of earth, there were other powers. Among the most terrifying were the Faerûn. Faerûn are difficult to describe without your imagination rebelling. They are aberrations, old, intelligent, hungry. They do not fit neatly into any mortal taxonomy. Some sages liken them to floating, many-tentacled nightmares, all tooth and malign intellect. Others insist that describing them at all invites them, as though attention were a beacon. I will describe them anyway, because fear thrives on vagueness. The Faerûn were, in the days of thunder, already ancient. The records disagree on their origin. Some claim they came from beyond Toril. Some claim they crawled up from deep underdark strata, older than stone. What matters is that they were present, they were powerful, and they were not content to share the world with the Saruk. The Saruk hated many things. They hated disorder. They hated surprise. They hated rivals. The Faerûn were all three. So Istosefifil became a war realm, a Saruk empire organized less like a sprawling administration and more like a fortress with a coastline. They built cities not merely for beauty, but for defense. Their stone was fitted tight. Their towers were carved with glyphs that doubled as wards. Their canals were also moats. Their temples were also armories. In the ruins, you can still find corridors designed to funnel intruders into killing zones, and chambers whose ceilings are etched with sigils meant to suppress teleportation and flight. But the greatest weapon Istosefifil raised was not a spear, not an army, not even a spell. It was geography. the Sharim and the decision at Kazim. Istosefifil was ruled in large part by a council of powerful mages known as the Sharim. Think of them not as wizards in the later Netherese sense, but as scholar lords whose authority derived from the belief that only those who understand life-shaping and deep magic deserve to govern. When the Faerûn pressed hard enough, when battles in the earth became too costly, when the Saruk realized that their rivals could not be simply exterminated, some of the Sharim convened a meeting in the fading halls of Okoth, in a place recorded as Kazim. That detail always chills me. Imagine it, the proud remnants of Okoth, an empire already dying, hosting a council of another empire's mage lords. Empires do not like admitting weakness, but they will share a table when fear is great enough. At Kazim, the Sharim chose an option so drastic that later historians sometimes call it the first world spell. They would reroute the narrow sea. Yes, you heard me. They would move a sea. The intent was simple: drown the Faerûn. There is debate about the exact mechanism. Some argue it was high magic in an early brutal form, multiple casters, days of ritual, the binding of elemental forces. Others argue it was life-shaping, scaled up to geology, altering the land's bones, persuading rock to flow like water, carving new channels through the continent. Either way, the effect was unmistakable. Around minus 33,800 Dale reckoning, Istosefifil redirected the narrow sea so that its waters flooded a region the Faerûn called Faerlin. The sea poured into underground hollows and surface basins. The Faerûn drowned. Or some did, many did. Enough did that Istosefifil could declare victory. And yet, my apprentice, listen carefully. A victory that costs you the climate is not a victory. It is a trade. By shifting the narrow sea, the Saruk did not simply drown enemies. They altered weather patterns, salinity, river routes, and the balance of ecosystems. Lands that had been fertile became brackish, wetlands became salt flats, forests sickened. Whole regions began a long decline into desolation that would, over thousands of years, contribute to the shaping of deserts and the migration of peoples. This is the first great ecological lesson of Faerûn. Magic can solve an immediate problem and create a slow catastrophe that future ages will mistake for natural. When you stand in a Naurok in later centuries, when you feel sand scour your cheeks and you see the sun glare off dunes like a blade, remember that the desert is not only the work of Netheryl's fall or Faerûn's spite. Part of it is the Saruk's earlier decision to weaponize water itself. Now, do not let the enormity of that distract you from a smaller detail that matters. Istosefifil did not only have enemies, it had servants. And its servants are another strand in the braid of consequences. Asabi, stingtails, and the craft of designed peoples. Within Istosefifil's territory lived servitor races shaped for war and labor. Two names appear often in inscriptions and later accounts: the Asabi and the Stingtails. Asabi were reptilian humanoids, sometimes described as lizard folk cousins, likely shaped for obedience, durability, and perhaps a limited capacity for independent invention. Useful enough to execute commands, not dangerous enough to innovate rebellion. Stingtails were smaller, quicker, sometimes depicted with barbed tails or venomous spines. Scouts, messengers, perhaps living traps. When later ages speak of monster races, they often forget that many of those monsters are the children of someone's design. They did not choose the role written into their bones. They were assigned it. That assignment echoes forward. Some of these peoples survive in scattered enclaves, others vanish, others evolve, mixing with wild stock, becoming something new. But all of them are a reminder. The Saruk's greatest monuments were not pyramids. They were bloodlines. Oreme and the Terra Seer. At the heart of Istosefifil lay Orem, a city whose name is still spoken among certain circles of arcanists with a mixture of awe and dread. In later ages, some will call Orem the oldest wizard city, though that is an oversimplification. It was, however, a place where the Saruk concentrated knowledge, where the Sharim's libraries and laboratories intersected. And within Oreme's shadow, one figure becomes important not only to the Days of Thunder, but to the entire arc of Faerûn's magical history. Arthindol, known in later legend as the Terra Seer. In the Days of Thunder, Arthindol is not yet a famous name among mortals. He is a Saruk of Istosefifil, a ruler and seer, described in later accounts as obsessively devoted to prophecy and preservation. Imagine that, if you can, a Saruk who understands that empires end and who chooses to outlast the end, not to rebuild, but to remember. Some sources claim Arthindol embraced Lichdom, becoming an undying guardian of lore, so that he could shepherd knowledge through the collapse of the creator races and into whatever came next. If that sounds familiar, my apprentice, yes, it is uncomfortably familiar. It is why I feel a strange kinship with certain ancient monsters. We are not similar in ethics, but we are similar in obsession. Arthindol's story stretches far beyond tonight's era. He is a thread that runs into later Netherese history, into the hunt for the Nether Scrolls, into the long chess game between ancient aberrations and mortal mages. So, I will not consume your entire evening with him now. Instead, I will mark him in your mind as a silhouette at the edge of candlelight, watching, recording, waiting. Because the Days of Thunder are full of such silhouettes, and because the next thing we must discuss, the Baetith, cannot be understood without the kind of mind Arthindol represents. A mind that believes knowledge deserves immortality, even if the world does not. The Baetith, an office older than crowns. You asked me, after the first episode, for a simple thing. You asked for the history of Faerûn. And I told you, gently but firmly, that Faerûn does not have a simple history. It has a layered one, a palimpsest of ages written over ages, where the ink of one empire seeps through the parchment of the next. The Baetith are one of those seep-throughs. Most mortals encounter history as a chain of names, kings, queens, battles, treaties. But in the Days of Thunder, the most consequential character is sometimes not a person. It is an institution. The Baetith were not a race, not a nation, not a religion, though they had rituals, and not a school, though they taught. They were an office, an order, a tradition, dedicated to one purpose: the systematic understanding of magic. In their own records, the Baetith's earliest incarnation begins around -34,000 Dale Reckoning, in the intellectual aftermath of Okoth's fragmentation and amid Istosefefil's rise. The Saruk needed answers. Their world was changing, rivals pressed from below. Other creator races stirred. The sky itself felt crowded, so the most gifted of their arcanists did something rare for an empire at its height. They admitted ignorance. Not publicly, of course. The Saruk did not do humility in front of servants, but in private, among their own, the question took hold. What is magic, truly, beneath the rituals? Is it simply the weave, a lattice to be plucked like a harp string? Or is it older, elemental, primal, something that existed before Mistral's net of order? What do our rivals know that we do not? And what can we steal, refine, and codify? Thus the Baetith. At first, it was Saruk. Then, this is crucial, it became more. Because a scholar's hunger does not care about national borders, it cares about novelty, it cares about results. Over time, the Baetith drew in other creator races, Batrachi and Eri. Sometimes willingly, sometimes through bargains, sometimes through coercion, sometimes, so the darker inscriptions imply, through recruitment that looked suspiciously like kidnapping. But regardless of how it happened, the result was unprecedented. A cross-species conclave of the most powerful mages of the age gathered not to rule, but to understand. And understanding, as you know, is power by another name. The Hall of Mists. Where did such beings meet? Not in a palace, not in a city center, not in a place that could be easily attacked by armies. They met where armies hate to go, in the deep wild. In later ages, humans will speak of the High Forest as though it has always been a place of ancient mystery, and they are right, though they rarely understand why. The High Forest, even then, was old. It was an artery of life across the continent, a place where the world's earliest magic pooled like dew. In that forest, the Baetith established a hidden stronghold that later mortals would come to call the Hall of Mists. To outsiders, it is, if it is anything at all, a ruin swallowed by vine and fog, a place where the air tastes wrong, where compasses misbehave, where the trees seem to lean in and listen. To those who know, it is a door. The Hall of Mists is a perfect symbol of the Baetith's philosophy. It does not announce itself. It obscures itself. It makes the seeker prove worth by persistence, by patience, by willingness to be uncomfortable. The Baetith did not build their stronghold to be admired. They built it to endure. Within its wards, they kept laboratories, libraries, ritual chambers, and the strange sanctums where their greatest work would be compiled. They also kept guardians, constructs of stone and magic that, in some legends, took the shape of ancient beasts, massive and implacable. Some sages insist there were stone golems in the form of dinosaurs, set to patrol the approach like living statues of extinction. Others call that embellishment. I call it plausible. Because if you can shape life, Why would you not shape your defenses to terrify? The Baetith as a tradition, not a person. Now you asked for a deep dive into the Baetith as a tradition, an office rather than a single figure. So let me paint you their structure as best I can. Membership in the Baetith was not simply being powerful. Power was necessary, but not sufficient. The Baetith cared about mindset. A Baetith was expected to be curious in a particular way. Not the wide curiosity of a bard collecting songs, but the surgical curiosity of a wizard dissecting a spell. They gathered magic the way collectors gather rare insects, carefully pinned, labeled, categorized. The Baetith trained apprentices, yes, but their apprenticeship was not like later human wizardry. It was closer to initiation into a secret craft. A prospective Baetith would be tested for resilience, physical, mental, spiritual. Many who sought entry never returned. Whether they died, were turned away, or were repurposed by the more ruthless members. The records are silent. If you want my interpretation, my apprentice, the Baetith were brilliant and often monstrous. Not because they wore fangs or feathers or scales, but because they treated living beings as variables in an experiment. And yet, do not make them cartoon villains. Real evil is rarely so simple. Some Baetith were likely sincere in their belief that codifying magic would prevent catastrophe, that if spells were understood, they could be controlled, that if the weave's principles were written down in a form that survived empires, later peoples would not repeat the same mistakes. Others were simply power-hungry scholars who wanted exclusive access. And these motives mingled. This too echoes forward. You will see it in Netherese arcanists. You will see it in red wizards. You will see it in Candlekeep even, though Candlekeep's monks would bristle at the comparison. Knowledge preservation is noble. Knowledge control is seductive. The two great works, Asikath and the Athora. Most people who have heard the word Baetith associate it with one thing, the Nether Scrolls. We will come to them and we will linger. But there is another Baetith creation that deserves mention here, because it reveals how far their ambition reached. Deep beneath what later ages will call Thaymount, the Baetith carved a cavern lair called Asikath. There they placed, or perhaps created, an artifact known as the Athora. What is the Athora? In later accounts, it is described as a mysterious object tied to Mystra's weave, so ancient that even the goddess names it in an elder tongue. It serves as a kind of anchor, a stabilizing node of magical structure, making a region ripe for grand ritual and, in darker hands, susceptible to exploitation. Why would the Baetith do such a thing? Because they were not content to study magic. They wanted to engineer it, to create fixed points in a chaotic world, to build safe foundations for spellwork that could outlast the deaths of individual mages, and perhaps to build levers. If you can anchor the weave, can you also pull it? Again, we step into uncertainty. The Athora is not as thoroughly documented as the Nether Scrolls. It is buried under layers of later history, later politics, later lies. But the mere fact that it exists in the record tells you something about the Baetith's scale. They were not thinking like mortals, they were thinking like an epoch. Now, hold that in your mind. A conclave of ancient mages spanning multiple creator races, meeting in a hidden stronghold, building anchors in the weave, and obsessively cataloguing the principles of spellcraft. What kind of book would such beings write? Not a spell book, not a grimoire, not a list of incantations. They would write a foundation. They would write a thing so fundamental that later ages would mistake it for divine revelation. They would write the Nether Scrolls, and in doing so, they would set the hook in Faerûn's jaw. A hook that the world has been trying to swallow ever since. The Nether Scrolls, the golden skins of the world serpent. If you have listened to me long enough, you have likely noticed a pattern. Every age has its monuments. Some are stone, some are blood, and some are ideas. The Nether Scrolls are an idea given physical form, and then cursed with the power to outlive everyone who tries to own it. What are they? Despite the name, the Nether Scrolls were not created by Netheril. The Nether in their title is later an accident of association, like calling an ancient sword by the name of the last hand that held it. In the oldest records, they are sometimes called the golden skins of the world serpent, an image that tells you much about Saruk symbolism. Knowledge as skin, knowledge as something shed and renewed, knowledge as something that wraps the world in coils. Different sources describe their physical form differently, but the broad shape is consistent. They are not parchment. They are not vellum. They are plates, sheets of precious metal, often described as gold or a gold-like alloy, sometimes edged with platinum, sometimes backed with obsidian or stone. They are durable in a way that feels almost alive. They resist corrosion. They resist time. Some accounts claim that if damaged, they repair themselves slowly, as though the metal remembers what shape it should be. And there are many of them. 50 by most traditions. 50 scrolls that are not rolled at all, but layered, stacked, and stored in ways that make the word scroll a poetic convenience rather than an accurate description. How do you read them? Here is where the Nether Scrolls become less like an artifact and more like a living hazard. To read a Nether Scroll is not to simply look at symbols and understand them. The scrolls do not behave like normal writing. They are arcane in the most literal sense. They contain secret structure. They reveal knowledge over time, sometimes differently depending on the reader's capacity. Think of it like this. A child can look at a star chart and see dots. A sailor can look at the same chart and see roots. An astronomer can look at it and see physics. Now, replace the star chart with an artifact that responds to your mind, your magical talent, and your assumptions. Replace dots with equations that rewrite themselves. Replace roots with spells that unfold like flowers. Many who study the Nether Scrolls report that each reading reveals something new, as though the scrolls do not give all their truths at once. Perhaps they were designed that way to prevent the unready from consuming more than they could survive. Or perhaps the scrolls simply have too much in them for any mortal mind to take in at once. Some readers become obsessed. Some become enlightened. Some go mad. The Waterdeep understood this. They did not create the Nether Scrolls as a gift to the world. They created them as a vault, a way to store dangerous knowledge without trusting it to fragile minds. A careful mage can take notes, translate concepts into safer forms, build lesser spellbooks from the scrolls' revelations. But the scrolls themselves remain raw. You might ask, what kinds of magic do they contain? That is the question that has ruined more lives than any demon's bargain. What is inside? The Nether Scrolls are not a list of spells, though spells can be derived from them. They are theory. They are arcane principles recorded by minds older than most civilizations. They include the magical practices of the creator races, the Saruk's life-shaping, the Batraki's watery stormcraft, the Iree's wind-binding and sky architecture. Most accounts agree they do not include the later high magic of elves, nor the runecraft of giants, nor the clan-forging traditions of dwarves, simply because those traditions had not yet emerged when the scrolls were compiled. In that sense, the scrolls are a snapshot of an early magical ecosystem, dangerously powerful precisely because it is unfiltered by later moral frameworks. Consider what that means. A Saruk writes magic as an engineer of flesh. A Batraki writes magic as a singer of tides. An Iree writes magic as an architect of sky. When those approaches are combined, when they are codified, when they are unified into a single reference, you get a book that does not teach you one school of magic. It teaches you how to rewrite the rules that schools are built upon. This is why later Netherese arcanists could leap from hedge wizardry to floating cities. It is not that they suddenly became smarter than elves. It is that they found a ladder. And ladders make climbing easier than wisdom deserves. Where were they made? Many traditions place the Nether Scrolls creation in Oreme, in the heart of Istosefifil, under the oversight of the Waterdeep. The timing is usually set near the end of the Days of Thunder, around -30,000 Dale Reckoning, when the creator races felt their era slipping and sought to preserve what they could. If you picture the scene, picture it like this. A chamber deep in a Saruk city, lit by witchlight that does not flicker in drafts. The air is cool and tastes of minerals. On a central dais lies a stack of metal plates, each etched with glyphs so fine they appear like hairline scratches, until you focus and realize they are words. Around the dais stand figures from 3 races that hate each other in the daylight world. A Saruk archmage, tail coiled in patient contempt. A Batraki storm singer whose skin glistens with salt. An Iree glyph scribe whose feathers rustle like parchment. They do not trust each other, but they trust the idea that knowledge is worth preserving. That is the paradox of scholars. They can hate you personally and still cooperate to save a library, so the scrolls are made. And then the age ends, and the scrolls are hidden, and then the scrolls begin haunting history, the Nether Scrolls as plot engine. You asked me specifically to treat the Nether Scrolls as a plot engine, to show where they appear later. So let me do that carefully, without stealing thunder from future episodes. First appearance, Netheril. Thousands of years after the days of thunder, human arcanists in the land that will become Netheril find the Nether Scrolls, or find part of them. The name most often attached to this discovery is Nargol Finder Ethar, who is said to have brought the scrolls into Netherese hands. What happens next is the reason every responsible historian develops a headache. The Netherese study the scrolls. They extract principles. They invent new spells. They build mythalars, engines of magic that can sustain enchantments on a city-wide scale. They raise enclaves into the sky. They become arcanists who treat the laws of reality as guidelines rather than commandments. And then, intoxicated by power they barely understand, they attempt the ultimate theft, Karsus's avatar. You know the broad shape of that disaster from the first episode. The moment a mortal tries to steal a god's divinity, and the weave shatters in response. The fall of Netheril is not solely because of the Nether Scrolls, but the scrolls are one of the enabling conditions. They are the first domino. Second appearance, Serpent Folk legacies. The Saruk do not vanish when their empires fall. They retreat, they hide, they become myths. Some embrace undeath. Some become guardians. Some become the monsters in the sealed tomb at the end of an adventurer's dungeon crawl. And some, like the Terraseer, become curators. As ages pass, serpent folk and their descendants, Yuan-Ti cults, Naga guardians, lizard folk shamans, carry fragments of Saruk tradition. They hunt the scrolls, they hoard them, they worship them, they fear them. Certain Saruk liches and guardians are rumored to possess individual plates. Some tales place a scroll in a sealed tomb in the deepest jungle. Others whisper of a scroll hidden in the ruins of a Saruk city called Hisari, watched over by a guardian named Shristi Santi, guardian of the atrocity, a name that suggests that even the Saruk sometimes regretted what they did. Whether all these stories are true in detail matters less than the pattern. The scrolls do not belong to one people. They belong to anyone arrogant enough to claim them. Third appearance, the long shadow over magical scholarship. Even when the scrolls themselves are not physically present, their influence spreads through derived knowledge. Every Netherese spellbook copied from the scrolls becomes a descendant. Every later magical tradition that inherits Netherese theory becomes a grandchild. Every ambitious wizard who dreams of breaking the ninth circle of spellcasting is, in a sense, dreaming with the scrolls' borrowed imagination. That is why I call the Nether Scrolls a plot engine. They are the early age artifact that keeps reappearing whenever the story needs a temptation big enough to topple a civilization. If you are a storyteller at a table, you use them as a hook. If you are a scholar in a library, you use them as an explanation. If you are a lich in Waterdeep's undervaults, you use them as a warning. Because the scrolls teach a cruel lesson. Knowledge can be more contagious than plague. You cannot unlearn what you have learned, and the world cannot forget what you have unleashed. A quiet question. Let me ask you something, my apprentice. If you found one plate of the Nether Scrolls, just one, and you knew it would make you a better mage than any of your peers, would you read it? Would you tell yourself you would only read a little? Would you tell yourself you are wiser than Karsus? Would you tell yourself you would use the power responsibly? Most people do. And that, more than any demon, is why Faerûn keeps repeating its tragedies. Now, we have spoken of the Saruk as architects of flesh, and of the Baetith as architects of magic. But the Days of Thunder are not the story of one race. The Saruk were first, yes. They were not alone. The swamps and seas had their own empires. And if the Saruk were engineers, the next creator race we must study were singers. Let us turn then to the Batrachi, and mind your step as we go. The floor grows wet in their history, and the depths are hungry. The Batrachi, empires of marsh and moontide. The Saruk, for all their brilliance, are easy to misunderstand because their evil is cold. The Batrachi are harder because the Batrachi are not cold. They are wet. They are changeable. They are the kind of people whose cruelty can feel like weather, sometimes deliberate, sometimes careless, always capable of drowning you. Where the Saruk carved stone and wrote laws into blood, the Batrachi built with what the world gave them: mud, coral, living wood, and the patient motion of water itself. Their cities did not always look like cities in the later sense. Some were reefs shaped into architecture. Some were floating platforms lashed together by living vines. Some were amphitheaters of stone built around tidal pools where the rulers could sit half submerged, listening to the seas whisper while their servants shivered on dry land. The Batrachi were amphibious, and more than that, they were mutable. Surviving descriptions paint them as humanoid when convenient. 2 arms, 2 legs, broad mouths, wide eyes, but also as shapeshifters capable of altering their bodies in ways that would have fascinated and terrified later druids. Some scholars argue that the Batrachi's shape-changing was not a single innate ability, but a cultural practice supported by magic. Rituals of adaptation, spells of flesh flexing, perhaps even life-shaping techniques, learned from Saruk rivals and made their own. However it worked, the effect was the same. The Batrachi did not see the world as fixed. They saw it as fluid. And a fluid world encourages a fluid morality. The rise of the water realms. Around minus 33,500 Dale reckoning, roughly the same era when Mahershal's Saruk control faltered and Yuan-Ti rose, the Batrachi reached their height. Their realm is often called simply the Batrachi Empires, because it was not one unified kingdom. It was a constellation of watery dominions linked by currents, trade, song magic, and the shared belief that land dwellers were temporary. The Batrachi were not wrong about the land's temporariness. Coastlines shift, rivers change, cities fall. But the Batrachi's attitude toward landfolk had a particular flavor: condescension with a smile. They were happy to trade with surface peoples, so long as surface peoples understood they were trading on Batrachi terms. And if surface peoples refused, well, storms happen. One of the most fascinating and horrific legacies of the Batrachi is their list of servitor races, peoples they either created, shaped, or culturally engineered to fill specific ecological and political niches. Bullywugs, those marsh-dwelling frog folk who still haunt swamps and ruin lakes. Kuo-toa, the mad fish folk of the Underdark, whose warped faith can create gods through sheer obsession. Lokatha, the fish humanoids who survive in coastal shallows and deep reefs, often caught between greater powers. Kopru, sinister aquatic manipulators in some older accounts, masters of mental domination. Sivs and Tako, names rarely spoken by modern sages because so few have seen them and survived, but remembered in old lists as Batrachi creations. And doppelgangers. Yes, doppelgangers. Some traditions claim the Batrachi either created or at least cultivated the earliest doppelgangers, living masks able to imitate others with unsettling precision. Whether this is literal or a later attempt to explain the origin of a shape-stealing people, the association is meaningful. Because the Batrachi understood a truth that later tyrants repeatedly rediscover. Control is easier when you can erase identity. Now imagine an empire that has spies who can wear your face, servants who can breathe in your drowned tunnels, and priests who can call storms by singing. That is not just power, that is environmental dominance. The lost realm of Colophon. Among the Batrachi's most famous dominions is a realm called Colophon, remembered because later geography swallows it. In some traditions, the lands of Colophon lie beneath what will someday become the Sea of Fallen Stars, a sea that, in much later ages, will feel like the heart of Faerûn. If that is true, then every sailor who crosses the inner sea is sailing above Batrachi ghosts, which is poetic in a way the Batrachi would appreciate. Colophon, by descriptions, was a land of marsh cities, river temples, and shallow seas. It was prosperous, not because it mined gold, but because it controlled water, fishing, pearl harvesting, trade routes, and the ability to deny others access to safe harbors. And Colophon is where we begin to see the Batrachi's political sophistication. They were not merely swamp savages singing to storms. They negotiated, they formed alliances, they used marriage, yes, even between different Batrachi lineages, to seal treaties. Their rulers understood that a good empire is not only built on magic, but on the management of ambition. Which brings us to one of the clearest names we have from the Days of Thunder, Zhokudian, the High One. Zhokudian is remembered as a High One, a title suggesting something between monarch and archpriest. In Batrachi culture, those roles blur. To command a people, one must command the tide of their faith. To command the tide of their faith, one must be able to speak to the water and be answered. Zhokudian ruled over a city that, perhaps tellingly, shares their name in some accounts. Whether that means the city was named for the ruler or the ruler took the city's name as a crown, we cannot say. Either way, Zhokudian becomes a symbol, the Batrachi at their most stable, most centralized, most confident. Zhokudian's reign, in later retellings, is painted as wise, not gentle. Batrachi wisdom can be sharp as coral, but wise. Zhokudian allegedly pushed for consolidation, for a more coherent Batraki response to external threats, for alliances among the scattered water empires. And external threats there were. Because as the Batraki expanded, they bumped into something enormous, the Jotunbrud and the coming of Omo. The Jotunbrud tribes were giant kin, proto-giants, titan-blooded peoples, or perhaps simply the earliest organized giant cultures, depending on which scholar you ask. Their name becomes a catch-all in later histories for those enormous ones who were here before the giants became what we recognize. They lived along coasts and highlands, and they did not appreciate Batrachi claims on water and marsh. The conflict between Batrachi and Jotunbrud is often called the Batrachi-Jotunbrud War. If you are looking for a neat start date, you will be disappointed. Wars like this begin as raids, then become retaliations, then become traditions, then become identity. But one figure in these wars steps out like a mountain rising from fog. Omo. Omo is named as a Titan Thane, a giant king, a war leader of immense personal power. In later accounts, Omo is associated with the storm of battle itself. A figure who could break a Batrachi war platform with one blow, who could wade through flooded trenches as though they were puddles, who could drag coral temples down with chains of iron and rage. Again, we must be cautious. Later ages love exaggeration. But consider the alternative. If Omo were not terrifying, Zhoukoudian would not be remembered. The death of Zhoukoudian. Around minus 31,500 Dale reckoning, Omo killed Zhoukoudian. That is the bare fact, and it is a pivot. Why? Because Zhoukoudian's death represents a breaking point in Batraki history. It is the moment the water empires realize that their magic is not an automatic win condition, that singing storms does not help when the enemy can endure storms, that drowning landfolk is less effective when the enemy can hold their breath, or simply walk along the seabed. Zhoukoudian's death also likely shattered whatever fragile unity the Batraki had achieved. In the wake of a strong ruler's fall, ambitious sub-rulers tend to compete. They blame each other. They accuse rivals of betrayal. They argue about strategy. And while they argue, the enemy advances. Now enter another name, one that will feel strangely familiar when we later speak of the plane of limbo and the horrors of chaos. Bazim Gorag, the Firebringer. Bazim Gorag appears in later lore as something monstrous, a Slad lord, a being of pure chaos. But some traditions trace Bazim Gorag back to the days of thunder as a Batrachi lord, a powerful entity of the water empires, perhaps one of Zhoukoudian's peers, perhaps one of their rivals. The title Firebringer is curious for an amphibious people. It suggests contradiction. It suggests that Bazim Gorag was not a typical Batraki ruler, but an innovator, a breaker of norms, someone willing to bring elements together that should not mix. Fire and water, order and chaos, stability and mutation. If Zhoukoudian symbolizes Batraki unity, Bazim Gorag symbolizes Batraki adaptability taken to an extreme. And this matters because of what the Batraki do next. the forbidden call. Cornered by the Jotunbrud, wounded by internal fragmentation, threatened by rivals on all sides, the Batraki did what desperate empires so often do. They reached for power they did not truly control. In the age of myth, we spoke of primordials, ancient beings of element and chaos, older than many gods, tied to raw forces like storm, fire, earth, and sea. The Batraki, in their desperation, turned to such forces. Some accounts describe them summoning primordials directly. Others describe them tearing open conduits to elemental realms. Others describe them invoking names that should not be spoken in a stable world. Whatever the mechanism, the result is remembered as a taboo. The Batraki broke something, and the world answered. Here, the historical record becomes foggy, not because nothing happened, but because too much happened. Cataclysms burn archives, floods wash away inscriptions. Survivors are too busy surviving to write clean chronologies. But we can trace the broad outline, a great magical backlash. A seven-turn winter in some legends, a climatic shock that battered ecosystems, and, most dramatically, an event often called the Tearfall. You have heard that word before if you listened to Episode 1's broad overview. Tonight, in the Days of Thunder, we are close enough to the Tearfall to feel its tremor. But before we step into that catastrophe, we must look upward. Because while the Batraki were singing to storms and drowning their enemies, the sky itself was being claimed. And the ones claiming it were not dragons, not yet. They were the Aeri, feathered empires, sky realms, the last and strangest of the creator races. Let us lift our eyes from the marsh water and look to the clouds. Because the next chapter of the Days of Thunder was written not in mud, but in wind. The Aeri, sky realms and feather glyphs. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes from living above the world. You stop thinking of forests as homes and start thinking of them as textures. You stop thinking of rivers as lifelines and start thinking of them as lines on a map. You stop thinking of people as neighbors and start thinking of them as weather. The Aeri were born into that arrogance, or perhaps they earned it. After all, to build a civilization in the sky requires a kind of daring that most peoples simply do not have. Even dragons, for all their flight, usually prefer lairs in mountains and caves. The Aeri wanted something else. They wanted height as identity. They rose to prominence late in the Days of Thunder, around -31,500 Dale Reckoning, when the Saruk were already fraying and the Batraki were already drowning their enemies in ambition. The Aeri's timing is not accidental. They appear when the world is destabilized, when older empires are distracted, when there is room in the upper air for new claims. Where did they come from? Again, contested. Some suggest they evolved from avian stock shaped by the world itself. Others argue they were the product of earlier experiments. Perhaps Saruk life-shaping turned toward the sky. Still others insist they came from elsewhere, arriving by planar rift, driven by winds older than Toril. Whatever their origin, by the time they appear in the records, they are fully formed as a culture, feathered humanoids with wings, taloned hands, keen eyes, and a strange mixture of scholarly devotion and predatory certainty. The Aerie saw themselves as the rightful rulers of the air. And if you control the air, you can threaten everyone. The three sky empires. The Aerie did not build one empire. They built three, linked by shared culture and rivalry. In the oldest accounts, these are called the Aerie Croca, the Aerie Siren, and the Aerie Quor. Do not worry about the suffixes, my apprentice. Think of them as three great branches of a feathered tree. Each branch claimed a different region of the sky and built a different kind of city. Viaku, city of Mount Havroquar. The Aerie Croca built their capital Viaku on Mount Havroquar, a peak that in those ages rose like a spear above ancient seas. Viaku's architecture is described as basalt spires and wind bridges, towers carved so narrow they seemed impossible, linked by arches that caught the wind like sails. To walk Viaku would be to walk a place that assumes you can fly. Stairs are not meant for you. Railings are unnecessary. The city is built for bodies with wings and minds that treat falling as a solvable problem. Fiukri, the Star Mount's library spire. The Aerie Siren built Fiukri in the Star Mounts, a mountain range that later ages will still consider ancient, still consider touched by primal magic. Fiukri is remembered not just as a city, but as a repository, a library spire, a place where the Aerie carved knowledge into stone and feather, where they stored spells on plumes and wind-borne glyphs. If the Saruk wrote magic as anatomy, the Aerie wrote magic as motion. Their glyphs were not merely symbols, they were instructions for air. Imagine a page that, when read, changes the pressure in your lungs. Imagine a rune that, when spoken, shifts the wind's direction. Imagine a spell that is not a fireball, but a jet stream. That is Aerie magic. Shara, the Orsraun rookery. The Aerie Quor built Shara in the Orsraun Mountains, a rookery city, a place of nesting towers and cliffside sanctuaries. Shara is remembered as more martial than the other two, a place where Aerie warriors trained, where griffin riders and other aerial cavalry drilled, where the sky was treated not as a library, but as a battlefield. And battle, my apprentice, is where we begin to see the Aerie's contribution to Faerûn's long list of horrors. The Aerie as makers. Like the other creator races, the Aerie did not merely rule. They made. The most widely attested creations associated with them are the Aarakocra and the Kenku. Aarakocra are the clearest, avian humanoids, often tied to elemental air, living in high mountains and distant skies. Many traditions treat them as descendants or creations of Aerie culture, either as servitors, allies, or lesser cousins, designed to fill ecological niches in regions the Aerie did not wish to settle directly. Kenku are more complicated. In many modern tales, Kenku are cursed, stripped of flight and creativity by divine punishment. How that curse interacts with the Aerie origin story is debated. Some scholars suggest the Kenku were Aarakocra-like peoples who fell from Aerie grace. Others suggest they were entirely separate, later cursed, and only linked to Aerie by superficial similarity. The truth may be messier. the days of thunder often are. What is consistent is that the Eyarie's legacy is written in feathers that still walk Faerûn today. Some sources also whisper that the Eyari created wyverns. Wyverns are draconic, yes, but lesser than dragons, winged, vicious, lacking the full intelligence of true worms. In Eyari lore, there is a tale of breeding landworms, primitive draconic beasts, into weapons of the sky, creating wyverns as living war mounts. Is this true? I do not know, but I find it credible because it fits the pattern. Every creator race takes what exists and makes it more useful. And usefulness in Empire often means more lethal. The Lamassu War. Around minus 30,700 Dale Reckoning, the Eyari fought a war against Lamassu, celestial-touched guardians, lion-bodied beings with humanoid faces and a stubborn sense of righteousness. It is a strange pairing, is it not? Feathered Empire versus Holy Guardian. Some chronicles frame it as the Eyari attempting to dominate sacred mountain passes and sky routes, only to find those routes protected by beings who considered the sky a trust, not a territory. Others frame it as Lamassu responding to Eyari arrogance with divine wrath. Either way, the Lamassu War matters because it shows the Eyari encountering something the Saruk and Batraki also encountered in different ways. Limits. Not every opponent can be drowned. Not every opponent can be reshaped. Not every opponent can be outflown. And when empires meet limits, they react. Sometimes by adapting, sometimes by escalating. The wasting plague and the temptation of Pazrael. Around minus 30,400 Dale Reckoning, the Eyari clashed with gnolls associated with a tribe called Ugnarash. Whether these gnolls were already demon-touched or became so during the conflict, the result is remembered in Eyari lore as the Wasting Plague. The details of the plague are fragmentary. Some describe a sickness that rotted feathers and lungs. Others describe a magical blight that twisted bodies and minds. Some blame gnollish curses. Some blame Eyari experiments that backfired. And some suggest a darker patron behind it all. A name appears in these whispers. Pazrael. Pazrael is associated with corruption, with fiendish influence. Whether the Eyari truly worshipped Pazrael, or whether later ages projected a demon onto a mysterious catastrophe, I cannot say with certainty. But the pattern is familiar. When an empire is threatened by disease, it seeks a cure. When the cure is not found quickly, it seeks a shortcut. And shortcuts in a magical world often have horns. If you want a lesson to carry into your own life, my apprentice, carry this. The first offer a fiend makes is always help, and the price is always paid later. The fall, the flight of dragons and Nagamat. Now we come to the end of the Eyari's time. Around minus 30,000 Dale Reckoning, as the days of thunder bled into what later ages call the Dawn Age, dragonkind rose in force. Some chronicles call it the Flight of Dragons, a coordinated assault, not merely random predation. Dragons in these accounts were not yet the scattered individualistic creatures of later centuries. They were organized, they were angry, and they were tired of sharing the sky. The Aari's towers were targets, their wind bridges were vulnerabilities. Their cities, built on the assumption of flight, became death traps when draconic fire turned narrow spires into chimneys. In the stories of Shara's fall, one name appears: Nagamat, a dragon general who conquered the rookery city and drove its people into scattering. Again, remember the nature of our sources. A dragon general could be a literal commander or simply a dragon whose leadership was so overwhelming that later historians treated it like a rank. But the point remains. The Aari fell. Their empire did not collapse gently. It burned, it cracked, it scattered into refugees and fragments. Some Aari are said to have fled west toward lands that later ages would call Anchorome. Others vanished into distant skies and plains. Others, perhaps the most tragic, fell and broke, joining the long list of extinct wonders that only leeches remember without effort. And yet, the Aari's fall did not erase them, because their creations endured. Aarakocra still ride thermals above mountains. Kenku still mimic voices in alleyways. Wyverns, if they were truly Aari bred, still terrorize caravans. And the Baetith's work, which the Aari eventually influenced, still sits like a sleeping dragon in the form of the Nether Scrolls. This is the cruel beauty of the days of thunder. Empires die, consequences do not. Now we stand at the threshold of catastrophe. The Batrachi have reached beyond themselves. The Aari's towers are burning. The Saruk are retreating into deep places and deeper schemes. And the world is about to be struck by a change so violent that later ages will argue about what caused it and what it even means. The tearfall, the splitting of worlds, the end of the creator race's dominion, and the beginning of an age ruled by dragons and giants. Come closer, my apprentice. The next pages are singed around the edges. A closer look. How the creator races changed the world one creature at a time. Before we let the tearfall crash down on us, I want to slow the pace. History, when told as a chain of dates, can make even apocalypses feel tidy. But the days of thunder were lived day by day, experiment by experiment, decision by decision. If you truly want to understand why these ages matter, why a war between scaled emperors and swamp singers should concern a modern adventurer buying rations in Waterdeep, you must look closer at the mechanisms. So let us do that. Let us look at the creator races not as empires, but as makers. Saruk life-shaping as an art of control. The Saruk did not think of species the way modern naturalists do. To them, species were not fixed categories. They were design families. A Saruk mage could look at a creature and ask, what is its purpose? What is its environment? What is its weakness? How do we make it more suited to what we want? And then, crucially, how do we ensure it cannot easily become something we do not want? This last question is why Saruk servitor races so often show signs of intentional limitation. Some are depicted with reduced fine motor control, making tool-making harder. Some appear with strong hierarchical instincts, making rebellion psychologically costly. Some have magical compulsions tied to scent, sound, or symbol, conditioning embedded in the nervous system. Life-shaping, in this sense, is not merely creation, it is governance. If you can write obedience into flesh, you do not need as many soldiers. You need only patience. The Yuan Ti as a theology of blood. I spoke earlier of Yuan Ti as ideology made flesh. Let me sharpen that. The Yuan Ti are not just altered bodies, they are altered desires. Many serpent cults operate on a promise: shed your weak skin, ascend into something purer, become more serpent, more divine, more true. This is not only religion, it is a pipeline. It is the Saruk's greatest political invention, a servant race that volunteers for deeper servitude because servitude is framed as holiness. The early Saruk likely used this to stabilize temple cities like Maharsholk. The priesthood could point to transformed Yuan Ti as proof that obedience leads to elevation. The common folk, whether human slaves or lesser reptilian servitors, could be offered the same dream, dangled like a lantern over a dark pit. And once the Saruk faded, Yuan Ti priest kings inherited the pipeline. This is why Yuan Ti survive when so many other servitor races do not. Their control mechanism is not only physical, it is spiritual. Naga, troglodytes, and the question of accidents. Not every Saruk creation was a success by their standards. Naga are powerful, intelligent serpentine beings, often guardians of law, often tied to ancient temples. Some legends treat them as deliberate creations, sentinel minds placed in bodies suited for eternal watch. Others suggest Nagas are the beautiful accidents of life-shaping, a design meant for one purpose that evolved into another. Troglodytes, foul-smelling reptilian humanoids, are often treated as crude, but crudeness does not mean lack of intent. A troglodyte's musk is repulsive to many surface peoples. That repulsion is, from an engineer's perspective, a defense. A troglodyte lair does not need a moat if intruders gag before they reach the inner chamber. And terrafolk, winged reptilian predators in some old lists, illustrate another Saruk instinct. If the sky is contested, create something that can contest it on your behalf. In this way, the Saruk were always responding to the world as it changed. And the world, in the days of thunder, changed rapidly. Batrachi, creation as social engineering. The Batrachi, by contrast, are harder to classify as makers because so much of their making may have been cultural rather than purely arcane. Yes, they shaped bodies. Yes, they created or cultivated servitor peoples. But Batrachi power often lies in a different lever: environment. A Batrachi does not always need to rewrite your bones. They can rewrite your habitat. Consider the bullywug. A bullywug is well suited to swamp life: webbed feet, leaping legs, a tolerance for mud and rot. Whether the Batrachi created the bullywug from scratch or simply refined a pre-existing frog folk, the result is a people perfectly adapted to live in the margins, marshes that other empires dismiss as worthless. Now consider the Batraki political use of such a people. Bullywugs can be placed in border swamps as a living buffer. They can be used as scouts. They can be used as expendable troops. They can be used as locals who understand terrain better than any invading army. A bullywug does not need to love the Batrachi to be useful. It needs only to need the swamp. The Quatoa show a darker brilliance. If Batrachi truly cultivated them, they cultivated not only bodies, but minds. Quatoa are notoriously susceptible to obsessive belief. Their faith can reshape reality in small ways. Their gods are often unstable. If you are an empire seeking control, a people whose belief can be directed is a powerful tool. You point them at a concept. You feed them ritual. You let their communal obsession do the rest. And if they break, if their minds splinter, if their faith becomes madness, well, madness still serves a purpose in war. It destabilizes the enemy. Doppelgangers, if the Batraki truly have a hand in their origin, represent the Batraki at their most politically sophisticated. A shape-stealer is not merely a spy, it is a weapon against trust. A doppelganger does not need to kill a king. It can become the king and make the kingdom rot from within. You begin to see why later ages fear them. They are empire tactics wearing a face. Aeri making as weaponized ecology. The Ayari's creations, Arakokra, Kenku, perhaps wyverns, suggest a different kind of maker instinct, weaponized ecology. The Ayari wanted the sky to belong to them, but the sky is not empty. It is a territory with currents, storms, predators, and limits. To control it, the Ayari did not only build cities, they built an ecosystem of aerial advantage. Arakokra allies or servitors extend Ayari influence into distant peaks. Kenku, whether fallen or designed, could serve as urban infiltrators, messengers, thieves, scavengers in the cracks of civilization. Wyverns, if bred, turn the sky into a battlefield where every caravan road is threatened from above. This is a kind of empire that does not need borders. It needs airspace, and airspace is everywhere. The Baetith's quiet war. Now let us speak again of the Baetith, because behind the visible wars between empires was another war, quieter, more insidious, a war for knowledge. You must understand, the Baetith did not exist in a vacuum. Saruk, Batraki, and Ayari members each entered the order with their own loyalties, their own rivalries, their own agendas. Imagine the debates in the Hall of Mists. A Saruk archmage argues that life-shaping is the pinnacle of magic because it makes subjects. A Batraki storm singer counters that magic's purpose is not to make subjects, but to make the world pliable. Water and wind are more eternal than blood. An Ayari glyph scribe scoffs and insists that true magic is architecture, to build structures that channel forces, to create cities that are spells, to make the sky itself obey. Do you see? The Baetith's work was not only compilation, it was synthesis. And synthesis always involves theft. If the Nether Scrolls contain a unified theory of early magic, that theory is built on compromise and rivalry. The scrolls are not a peaceful collaboration. They are a negotiated artifact, a treaty written in metal, where each contributor tries to ensure their worldview remains central. This is why the scrolls can be so transformative. They do not present one approach, they present many, braided. And braided knowledge is stronger than any single strand. A note on the small folk of a giant age. One more thing, my apprentice, before the world breaks. It is tempting, when speaking of creator races, to imagine that only they lived in these times, that the world was a stage reserved for 3 empires and their monsters. That is not true. Humans existed. So did other mortals in protoforms. They were not dominant. They were not unified. They were, in many places, prey. Some lived as slaves in Saruk temple cities, used as labor and breeding stock. Some lived as coastal scavengers, hiding in reeds when Batraki raiders sang storms into their villages. Some lived in high valleys, watching Ayari shadows pass overhead like omens. Most left no records, but they mattered, because survival is a kind of inheritance. The humans who endured the days of thunder carried forward instincts, fear of serpents, fear of the sea, awe of the sky, that later shaped myths and religions. They became the raw clay from which later human cultures would rise once the creator races faltered. Remember them, because history is not only the story of those who write it, it is also the story of those who endure it. Now, we have looked closely enough. We have examined the maker's hands, not just the monument. And now the hand slips. Now the world shudders. Now the days of thunder end the way so many ages end in Faerûn. Not with a treaty, not with a graceful decline, but with catastrophe. Let us speak then of the tearfall. The tearfall, when the world flinched. There are many ways to end an age. Some ages end with a slow fade. Trade routes shift, populations dwindle, borders shrink. Some end with conquest. A banner changes, a language changes, and historians argue whether it is a new era or merely a new coat of paint. The days of thunder end the way a thunderstorm ends when the sky has been holding too much charge for too long. They end with a crack, and then a flood, and then silence, broken only by survivors trying to name what happened. What caused the tearfall? Here the chronicles disagree, and you must hold multiple truths like candles in both hands. One tradition, common in later human histories, blames the Batraki. It says that as the Batrachi-Jotunbrud war turned against them, as Jokudian fell and the tide turned red, Batrachi high mages broke taboos and summoned primordials, ancient elemental powers whose names were never meant to be spoken by mortal tongues. In this telling, the Batraki did not merely call a storm, they called a god storm. And the world answered with a violence that did not care who started the argument. Another tradition, often favored by draconic myth, speaks of Asgorath, the world shaper. Now, in later ages, dragons use the name Asgorath as a title for their own creator, Io in some tongues, while other tales treat Asgarath as a primordial force, a shaper of worlds rather than a patron of any one race. The overlap is messy, myth often is. But in this tradition, Asgarath hurls an ice moon or a shard of celestial ice at the world. A weapon thrown from the heavens to punish arrogance, to reset the balance, to end an age that had become too crowded with mortal engineering. Is that literal? Perhaps. Is it metaphor? Perhaps. Here is what I, as a scholar, can say with confidence. Something fell. The sky itself betrayed the ground. Fragments of celestial matter struck the world, whether one great impact or many smaller ones, and the physical consequences were unmistakable. Seas surged, mountains buckled, forests burned, the air filled with ash and glittering dust. The climate shifted, the landmass of Maruroboros cracked and reshaped. The world quite simply flinched. And in that flinch, civilizations snapped. The day the seas walked. Imagine my apprentice standing on a coastal ridge in those ages. The air is humid. The jungle behind you buzzes. The sea ahead, narrow sea, silver sea, whatever name it bears in that place, is calm enough to reflect clouds. Then the horizon changes, not with a storm line, with a wall, a tsunami, born from impact and quake, rises and moves with a speed that does not feel like water. It feels like a living thing deciding to kill you. It hits. Coral cities shatter, marsh platforms tear loose and tumble like toys. Stone ziggurats, built by Sarukh to endure, are swallowed and filled with silt. Batraki temples become tombs. And the sea pulls back, dragging survivors and debris with it, leaving behind fields of dead fish and broken gods. This is why later ages remember the tearfall with a shiver. It is not only the falling sky. It is the walking sea, fire in the rain. Inland, where the ocean cannot reach, another violence arrives. The air is filled with meteoric debris, heated, glowing, falling like a rain of knives. Forest canopies ignite, rivers boil at the surface, whole valleys fill with smoke so thick it turns day into dusk. The Aerie, perched on their spires, see the first fires from above. Imagine them, feathered scholars and warriors, watching their world burn like a scroll held too close to a candle. Some flee, some fight, some fall, their wings singeing, their towers collapsing beneath them. The Sarukh retreat into their deep places, sealing doors behind them with spells that later ages cannot easily break. Their philosophy has always been about control. In the Tearfall, they discover what it is like to be controlled by something larger. The Batrachi, children of water, find that water cannot save them from a world being rewritten. Some are drowned, some are frozen, some are hurled inland by the sea, stranded like fish on a beach. Their song magic, tuned to storms, cannot sing back a falling sky. And the small folk, the humans hiding in reeds, the scattered tribes, the proto-cultures, experience the Tearfall not as history, but as terror. They run, they cling, they remember the split, Aber and Toril. Now we come to one of the most contentious claims in Realms cosmology, the splitting of Aber Toril into the twin worlds of Aber and Toril. Some traditions place this split far earlier, in the primal wars of gods and primordials, arguing that the twin world forms are a consequence of cosmic conflict rather than a mortal age's catastrophe. Other traditions place the split here in the Tearfall's aftermath, arguing that the damage to reality itself was so severe that the overgod Ao intervened, dividing the world to prevent total collapse. One half claimed by primordials as Abeir, the other held by the gods as Toril. Which is correct? Perhaps both. It is possible that the world had already been conceptually split in divine terms, and the Tearfall made that split manifest in physical geography. It is possible that the Tearfall was one of several shocks that loosened reality enough for Ao's division to take hold. It is possible that later sages, lacking better language, conflated multiple epochs into one grand narrative. What matters for our story is this. After the Tearfall, the world is not the same. Pieces of land and peoples become unstable across ages, sometimes trading places between Abeir and Toril in later cataclysms. The concept of twin worlds becomes relevant, even if the precise moment of separation remains debated. If you are a historian, you note the uncertainty. If you are an adventurer, you simply learn to expect the impossible. The end of the Creator race's dominion. The Tearfall does not necessarily exterminate the Creator races, but it ends their era. Empires built on precise control do not survive when the environment itself becomes chaotic. The Saruk lose their surface dominion. Their cities become ruins, some swallowed by jungle, some buried by sand, some sealed in stone. Their surviving enclaves retreat into secrecy, into the Underdark, into plains, into Lich-guarded vaults of knowledge. Their servitor races scatter, evolve, rebel, or inherit. The Batraki's water empires fragment. Some are wiped out by flood and climate shock. Some flee into stranger places. There is a persistent tradition that a portion of the Batraki escaped into the plane of limbo, becoming something else over time. Creatures of chaos, no longer amphibious rulers, but beings of shifting flesh and unpredictable hunger. Whether that tradition is literal or symbolic, it captures a truth. The Batraki's relationship with change eventually consumed them. The Ares sky realms burn and fall. Their survivors scatter to distant continents and high peaks, leaving behind only fragments of architecture and the lingering presence of their created peoples. And into that vacuum, into the cracked, cooling world, new powers rise. The Dawn Age begins. When the dust settles, when the seas stop rushing, when the fires die down to smoldering scars, the climate changes, the world cools, glaciers begin to grow in the far north, the great beasts of earlier warmth retreat or adapt. New land is exposed where ice and water shift. And into this world, dragons rise as dominant forces, not just solitary terrors, but the defining powers of an age. Giants, too, emerge into prominence, forging the first outlines of what will later be called Ostoria. Dwarves stir beneath the earth, their earliest ancestors awakening in deep halls and caverns, drawn to stone and metal by instincts that will one day become clan tradition. Elves, still bound to fairy in many tales, begin the slow process of becoming what they will become, though their great flowering lies ahead. The days of thunder end. The Dawn Age begins, and the world, scarred, reshaped, and somehow still alive, turns another page. A lesson to carry forward. If there is one moral lesson in the days of thunder, it is this: power without humility will eventually meet a force it cannot engineer. The Saruk taught us that life can be rewritten. The Batrashi taught us that environment can be weaponized. The Aerie taught us that height is not safety. The Ba'atith taught us that knowledge can be preserved dangerously well. And the Nether Scrolls taught us that temptation can be immortal. If you are listening to this lorecast not merely for entertainment, but to enrich your table, your campaign, your characters, consider how these ancient currents still flow. A Yuan-Ti priest in the modern age is not merely a villain. They are the inheritor of a philosophy built in Mahershal's shadow. A doppelganger in Waterdeep is not merely a spy. They are a relic of Batraki tactics, wearing a face like a knife. An Aarakocra on a distant peak is not merely an exotic ally. They are a living footnote to Aerie ambition. A wizard who chases Lost Netherese spells is not merely ambitious. They are following a trail that begins in the Hall of Mists, on golden plates etched by creatures who never cared about human morality. And that, my apprentice, is why we study the deep past. Not because it is dead, but because it keeps moving, setting the lantern toward next week. In our next lesson, Episode 4, we will step fully into the Dawn Age, the time of dragons and giants. We will speak of the first great draconic dominions, of ancient worms whose names are now only runes on shattered stone. We will speak of giantkind's rise into Astoria, of the Ordning's roots, of storm kings and fire forges and cloud citadels. We will speak of the early wars that reshaped mountain chains and taught the younger peoples what it means to live beneath creatures the size of legends. And we will watch carefully for the first hints of the elven ascendancy to come, because the age of dragons and giants is the crucible that prepares the world for the first flowering. Now, before you go, I have a request. Leave me your curiosities. Tell me what you want to linger on. Do you want a deeper dive on Pilitith and the Saruk's planar wanderings? Do you want an episode devoted to the Faerûn, where they came from, how they survived drowning, and why they return as a terror in later ages? Do you want to trace Bazim Gorag's shadow from Batraki Lord to Chaos Monster? Do you want to explore the Hall of Mists and the Ba'atith as a secret society? Its rites, its betrayals, its lingering echoes? Do you want to know more of Nagamat, the dragon general who broke Shara? Name a time, name a character, name a faction. Your comments are the lanterns you hand me, and I can only illuminate so many corridors at once. The candles are low now, and even a lich knows when a lesson has reached the point where the mind begins to blur. So close your notes, cap your ink, and let the days of thunder settle in your thoughts like distant rolling sound. Before you go, a seer's candle, Arthindol and the choice to outlast. Before I thank you for listening, before we set the lantern toward next week, I want to give you one more story. Not because the chronology demands it, but because the heart of this era demands it. The days of thunder can feel like a parade of inhuman empires, scales, swamps, feathers, names that sound like spells rather than people. It is easy, if you are not careful, to treat it all as distant myth. So let me place a single figure close enough to the candle that you can see the edges. Arthindol, the Terraseer. Remember him from earlier, an istosephil seer whose name survives because he did what empires hate. He admitted they were temporary. We do not have a neat biography of Arthindol. We have fragments, mentions in later lore, insinuations in ancient ruins, and the uncomfortable consistency of multiple traditions that all agree on one point. He chose to remain. When others fled, he stayed. When others buried truth under propaganda, he wrote. When others tried to build a future, he tried to preserve a past. If you want to understand the Bayatith's mindset, and by extension the Nether Scrolls' existence, contemplate this kind of choice. Imagine Oreme in its last confident century. The city is still alive, hiss of water through carved channels, the faint chemical tang of alchemical basins, the low murmur of Saruk voices speaking in measured tones. Above, the world is uneasy. Storms in the distance, rumors of Batraki summoning, reports of Aerie towers burning, whispers that the narrow sea's rerouting has done more harm than victory. In the center of a high chamber, Arthindol stands before a wall of polished stone, so reflective it might as well be a mirror. Yet the wall is not a mirror. It is a scrying surface, a divination medium tuned to show possibilities rather than certainties. And what does he see? Not one future, many. In one, the Saruk retreat and endure, rebuilding in secret. In another, their servitors rise and hunt them. In another, the desert grows and the world forgets their names. In another, the Nether Scrolls, yes, already existing or nearing completion in some visions, are discovered by humans who build floating cities, then fall like stones. In another, the Faerûn, drowned, yes, but not dead, return like a fever beneath the world, waiting for a time when the surface grows arrogant again. In another, dragons rule openly, and giants throw mountains like dice. Divination does not always show the truth, but it shows enough truth to terrify. Arthindol, in these reconstructions, is not terrified in the way a human would be. He does not cry. He does not beg. He does not pray for mercy. He does what a Saruk does when confronted with an unsolved problem. He searches for a solution, and the solution he chooses is immortality. Now, you and I know what lichdom is in later ages. We know it as a horror, a mortal twisting soul and body into an anchor for undeath, feeding on life, clinging to power. But in the days of thunder, immortality is not yet a trope. It is an experiment. It is a question. Can a mind outlast its civilization? Can knowledge be preserved without trust in successors? Can memory be made into a fortress? Arthindol's answer is yes, at a price. Whether he performed the ritual himself or was aided by Bayatith peers, whether he bound his essence to a phylactery of Saruk craft, or to something stranger. The details are lost. What remains is the consequence. Arthindel becomes a keeper of lore through ages that would otherwise grind it into dust. He becomes a living archive. He becomes a problem for anyone who comes later seeking what he guards. And that, my apprentice, is the point. The Days of Thunder did not only produce ruins. They produced guardians. They produced long memories that refused to die. When you explore an ancient tomb and find an undying sentry that speaks in forgotten tongues, you are not merely encountering a monster. You are encountering a philosophy that believes the past is property. Arthindel embodies that philosophy in its most potent form. He is the Bayateeth's impulse made flesh or unflesh. And he is also, in a way, my warning to you. Because the temptation to preserve can become the temptation to control. And the temptation to control can become the excuse to do terrible things for history. So when we study these ages, do not only ask what happened, also ask, what did it make people willing to become? Now, thank you for indulging that candle of character in an era of empires. Let us return to the broader road and to our next lesson. Thank you, dear listener, for returning for this installment of the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. And one last word from our sponsor, Dharma Web Solutions. If you need robust web applications, thoughtful architecture, and elegant code, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. Their support helps keep these candles burning in Waterdeep's hidden libraries. If you are a business, a creator, or a patron who would like to sponsor this Lorecast, or if you are a musician who would like to submit your work as a potential background track for the show, reach out to taleofthelich @gmail.com for sponsorship information and submission details. Until next week, may your maps be accurate, your memory be stubborn, and your curiosity unafraid of the dark. Good night, adventurer. Good night, my eager apprentice, and may the thunder you hear in your dreams be only the echo of history turning its pages.